We're 19 days away from the election. So can Republicans take back the Senate in less than 3 weeks? According to Len Foxwell, a Democratic strategist, the Midwest might be a key for these races. Here to discuss is Justin Robert Young. He's the host of Politics podcast. So Justin, what do you think? Which Senate seats do you think that the Republicans could actually pick up in this cycle?
Well, I think that this is the most favorable Senate map that the Republicans have had in a very, very long time. And they're going to be very regretful if they don't put a lot of points on the board when election night and however long it takes afterward to count the votes is said and done. But that being said, I believe that the Republicans have control of the Senate just by the fact that Tim Sheehy in Montana is looking like he has a pretty safe lead over John Tester, and you have Jim Justice and his dump truck of a dog in West Virginia that is going to boat race any Democrat that runs against them. So that's the Senate right there. But when you really look at the padding, when you want to put more of a gap between it, Bernie Moreno, morning consult poll came out today that has not been favorable to Republicans at all in those Senate races, had him up over incumbent Sherrod Brown. That's very, very big. And then the other two are Eric Hovde in Wisconsin, and Mike Rogers and the Pennsylvania Senate seat where Bob Casey is the incumbent. It looks like McCormick has been running very, very close in that race. The big question is, will there be ticket splitting on a heretofore unseen level? Because the polling shows Donald Trump doing very well, if not leading in some of those states, but the Senate candidates running in some polls anywhere between 8 and 10 points behind, at least up till now.
Justin, I'm curious. We were talking yesterday with someone about the funding issue and the disparity really between, Republicans and Democrats and how much money is, put out there. And I think when you look back at the midterms, it really is mind blowing how many people were outspent by Democratic candidates. This time around, what do we see in terms of funding? I mean, I know Ted Cruz was, I think, on with Glenn Beck today complaining, I'm getting $0 from Mitch McConnell and his war chest. What does the scene look like? Is it any different than last time around?
No, it really hasn't. The Republican Senate candidates have been outraised as they were by the Democrats last time. And this is another problem with candidate selection as well. So Ted Cruz, for example, who I do think is running at a pretty comfortable lead in front of Colin Allred, at least now with the polls in aggregate, is among the most well-known people in politics, let alone the Senate. So he's not going to have a problem with name ID in Texas. But what you've seen in the post-Trump era is that you've had a lot of candidates that have come either new to politics or politicians that have never won statewide before. So say whatever you will about Bernie Moreno and McCormick and Hovde and Rogers, none of them have ever won statewide in the states that they are running in right now. And when you really talk about what you need money for, it's name ID. Because especially when you're polling, you're going to say, oh, well, this person's name I've heard before because they're the incumbent senator. This person I've never heard of. So why would I vote for Bernie Moreno if I've never heard of a Bernie Moreno before?
All right, so that's the Senate. Let's take a look at the House races right now. Is there anything spicy out there? Is there anything going on in House races that you think could have a very big impact?
I'll tell you what. I think that if the Republicans win the House, and if Donald Trump wins the presidency, I would expect the Republicans to win the House, that we might look back at the big events that Donald Trump just ran in Coachella, California, and the MSG rally that he's going to do at the end of this month as the reason why the House is going to turn on contested seats in blue states, in my opinion. Obviously, you have a lot of these seats that are in the swing states, and those are already spoken for. You already have so much money and so much attention that's going to be trying to push these various seats wherever in terms of Republican and Democratic influence. But in California, in Southern California, in some of those seats in New York, which essentially is the only reason why the Republicans had their slim majority in the House during the midterms, which did not go the way that they wanted to. It was New York that made the difference there. And so I wonder if this is rosy for Republicans after Election Day. You might look at that MSG rally and say, well, wow, that was a big in-kind contribution from the Trump campaign, which has been a little bit maybe at times not exactly hand in glove with the Republican Party writ large.
Justin, that is one of the better points that I've heard about those rallies from what anyone's saying, and it's very true, right? I mean, that the only bright spot in those states, in those one-party states, is really for the right, is what you see happening in these recalcitrant and even growing, right, rebellious House districts. So that makes a ton of sense. I actually am curious. I want you to go back to history a little bit. Jill was just telling me before the show about this history podcast we're both interested in. You apparently have some thoughts on the 1960s elections and how they relate to what's going on today.
Absolutely. I'm so glad you asked about it. So, it's called Raise the Dead. I've done 2 seasons of it, one focusing on the 1960 election between Kennedy and Nixon and the 1964 election of Goldwater and Johnson. It started after 2016 when I've always been fascinated with the 1960 election, largely because we don't talk about it a lot. And it's odd to me because 2 of the most famous presidents of all time ran against each other. It also is something that has a lot of seeds of where we've come. And that's what I focused on in Raise the Dead, was really comparing the Kennedy campaign in 1960 to Donald Trump's campaign in 2016, where I think that there are a lot of hallmarks in terms of where I think deliberate hallmarks that the initial Trump 16 campaign looked to pattern from the Kennedy campaign. Probably the biggest, and I think the most undeniable, was taking advantage of new media. The new media at the time in 1960 was television. Not only was the JFK campaign one of the first private owners of a VCR, that was new tech at the time, but they also pioneered the concept of editing down Kennedy's speeches into 1 minute, 30-second, and 15-second clips that they would voluntarily mail to television stations specifically tailored to the kind of word that they wanted to get out in those specific areas. That didn't happen before. It's now standard practice. Well, now less standard practice because people don't send videotapes, but it used to be, especially through the 60s, 70s, and 80s and 90s, just what every campaign did. Similarly, you had a lot of hallmarks to the Nixon campaign, to the Clinton campaign, especially with some really, really head-scratching decisions on where they were going. But yeah, that's Raise the Dead.
It's incredible. And of course, Nixon going on to have a young Roger Ailes tell him he needs to pay more attention to TV. And then he does and becomes the master of it. But I would argue not the master of digital, right? Fox Nation is not quite where maybe it ought to be. I want to before we have to leave you. I want to make sure that we get at least your basic take on what the heck you think is going to happen in the next few weeks.
Whew, I'll tell you what, I am generally a default to the norms guy. Like, I think that politics is a lot of noise. It's a lot of trying to shape the narrative. And so you just want to look at basic trend lines. And the basic trend line here is that this is an extraordinarily close election that will likely be decided by less than a point in the states that really, really matter. So you start looking in the margins and you start looking at how the campaigns are operating. Right now, I see one campaign in Donald Trump that is operating with nearly supreme confidence. They are picking and choosing where they are going. They are running these gigantic rallies that are going to get massive press attention in unconventional areas because Donald Trump wants to project himself as a unifying candidate that is unafraid to go anywhere. And then you have the Harris campaign, which seems to be throwing a lot at the wall. It doesn't seem like they are confident with where they are. They are moving television ad buys from Wisconsin into Pennsylvania. That doesn't seem like they are comfortable with where they need to be. They're throwing out new plans, like their economic opportunity plan for black men that came out on Monday, which was a bit of a head scratcher. So I think it's close. Anybody could win it. But if you are just looking at how these campaigns are operating, one of them sure seems like they are winning, and the other seems like the exact opposite.